I have been so excited to do the session on psychological safety because when I really think about psychological safety is just near and dear to my heart. I really believe in it on top of leadership development as a whole. I truly believe that when we have that in our organizations, we're just happier. People just do amazing things at work. So I'm going to go ahead and start doing this session about psychological safety. But before we begin, I really want you all to think about the teams that you have been on, both good and bad. So I'm going to give you 10 seconds to think about those workplaces that you've been on. Think about those teams that you've been on that have been really, really good teams. Think about the opposite as well. Those teams that have, maybe they just weren't a positive experience for you. What teams have you felt comfortable in? Also think about what teams have you felt uncomfortable in. So chances are that the teams that you probably felt more comfortable in, and I'm talking about sharing ideas, bringing your whole self to work, those teams probably had a high degree of psychological safety. So that brings us to the $1 million question, right? Well, what is psychological safety? I know for me, I have been hearing this term be thrown around over and over and over, and probably more so probably in the past 2 to 3 years. So we're going to go ahead and do a quick poll, and then I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen so that we can get into this content and really look at what is psychological safety and what is not psychological safety. So let's go ahead and do a quick poll. I'm going to go ahead and launch it. And you have 4 different choices here. So what is psychological safety? Psychological safety is a work environment approved by a psychologist. Psychological safety is about being nice. Psychological safety means freedom from conflict. Or 4, psychological safety equals acceptance of all ideas. So go ahead and take a minute to go ahead and take my quick poll, and we'll go ahead and discuss. Give you all a couple more seconds here. All right, I'm going to give you about maybe 5 more seconds. We still have a couple people that are actually, I think we're almost at the 100% here. But as you're in this course today, I really want you to think about that question that I asked earlier. Think about those teams that have been really good. What made that team really good to be on? And then think about the team that you felt, I just was not comfortable on this team. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and let's go ahead and share the results of that. So I think you all are able to see my screen on the results. So most of us, actually the majority of us, 92% put number 4, which is psychological safety equals acceptance of all ideas. Few of us, about 3 of us, picked 3, psychological safety means freedom from conflict. So let's go ahead and talk about this poll really quickly. All of the answers that I put on that poll are actually all myths. None of those are actually true surrounding psychological safety, which is quite interesting because a lot of times when we talk about psychological safety, we think about this nice environment, but it's not about that. And I really wanted to put that out there. So yes, I did trick all of you into that. What we really need to understand is that psychological safety is a whole different thing. And so we're going to talk about that. And so one of the questions that I want to ask you before we really get into our training is, think about how you are as an individual. Who here likes to be placed in an unsafe environment? I'm betting all of you, if not most of us here, would like to avoid that unsafe environment. And let me go ahead and give you an example. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so that we can really picture this example that I'm about to give you. So let me go ahead and share my screen for a moment. Let me find what computer screen I'm sharing. So you're all good. So here's the poll that you all just took. So go ahead and picture this moment. So I just asked you the question, who here likes to be placed in an unsafe environment? And I'm willing to bet that most of us don't like to be placed in an unsafe environment. So let's just say you are enjoying a day at the beach. You're enjoying a day at the beach with your family, and you are enjoying everything that comes along with being at the beach. I mean, I'm betting that everyone right now wants to be at that beach. I even have a nice, pretty picture for you all right now. And all of a sudden you're at the beach, it's really hot outside, and you just say, you know what, I want to go into the water and I just want to cool off. Because again, we really understand what does safety mean? Because in order to understand psychological safety, we need to understand what safety means first. So you're in that water, and then all of a sudden you're enjoying that quick dip in the water, and someone yells out a phrase that you do not ever want to hear when you are in the water at the beach. They say shark. So there's a shark in the water right next to you. What are you going to do next? Are you going to stay in the water? Or are you going to get out of the water? I might have some people here that might say, no, I'll stay in the water. Maybe not. But for those of you thinking that you're going to get out of the water, why are you going to get out of the water? Go ahead and throw it in the chat. Why are you getting out? Most of us are probably going to choose, I'm going to get out of the water. And the reasoning for that is because we have this need for safety. And so if we have that need as human beings, then let's go ahead and talk about that need first. Because like I said, in order to understand psychological safety and what that means in the workplace, we need to go ahead and talk about that need. So I'm going to take you all back to Psychology 101. I remember my UCR days when I was a student and I was taking Psychology 101, and we talked about this model, right? We talked about the model that really highlights the priorities of the needs in our life. The need for safety was acknowledged as a basic human need by Abraham Maslow in his hierarchy of needs. It comes after air, water, which is the things that we need that are essential to us for survival, right? We need food, air, and water to survive. And the very next thing that we need after that, that's included, is basically that psychological safety that we're talking about. Now, on this pyramid, if you're looking at it, the needs that are higher up, so you have your love and belonging, esteem, and self-acceptance, they cannot be met until the needs below of that are met. So if we're looking at this psychological safety and we're tying this to performance, if people do not feel safe, they cannot learn. If people do not feel safe, they will never have a sense of belonging or engagement. And if people do not feel safe, they're going to completely shut down and they're not going to achieve whatever results we're trying to get them to achieve in this business. So what we're going to be doing for the remaining time that we have together today is we're really going to be talking about 3 different questions that we're going to answer. What is psychological safety? Do we have psychological safety? And how do we create and maintain that psychological safety? Because again, we all did that illustration in the water, right? We all can say that we have that need. We need to feel safe in that environment. So let's go ahead and talk about those things that we're going to talk about in our agenda today. What is psychological safety? Do we have it? And how can we maintain it? So now that we've talked about that safety need, let's talk about, well, what is that psychological safety? And what does that mean to us? And what does it mean to us in our own work environments? So psychological safety, going back to the 4 myths that I tricked you all at, team members feel safe to take risks and be vulnerable in front of each other. So the term psychological safety was coined by Harvard Business School professor Amy Edmondson. And so she defined this environment where people could be honest with each other. They believe that they can speak up with their work, with relevant thoughts. They could ask questions. They can talk about concerns. They can talk about mistakes. You name it, that is psychological safety. Psychological safety is simply an environment that I like to say where learning can happen, where you have people that are going to thrive. You're going to have people that are going to confront ideas, challenge conversations. And really, this is a really important job for leaders today. I mean, imagine being in this kind of environment where you feel good about this team that you're being on. And so again, think about that question that I asked you earlier. What teams did you like to be on and what teams did you not like to be on? So if we take a deeper look into psychological safety, this is what we have when we have psychological safety, right? We have an environment where we can admit the mistakes that we've made. I mean, think about it. It's hard. Sometimes when we make mistakes, it's hard to admit those mistakes. Where we can learn from our failure, where everyone has open ideas and we can learn to agree to disagree, or disagree agreeably, how I like to call it. And we have better innovation and decision making. Let me tell you this quick story so that we can really highlight how it feels to have this psychological safety in our work environments. In my very, very first job, so many, many years ago, I made a mistake at work. I actually missed a typo in a printed brochure that cost the company a reprint of the order. Well, my boss at the time flew into rage over this, completely belittled me in front of the entire team. Of course, how am I going to react? I'm human. I was rattled. I was upset. And unknowingly in that minute, I was forced into this perfectionist mode, right? And I remember I said, I will never, ever make a mistake like that again. Now, fortunately for me, later in my career, I have been able to make all kinds of mistakes in more supportive environments. So one of those things, I'm not cured of my perfectionism yet, still working on that, but I have learned that it is possible to create spaces where mistakes can have a positive impact on the mistake maker and on the person that's, making that mistake. That is where you find psychological safety, where yes, maybe there's correcting that needs to happen. But again, how is it that experience that I went through has been, 15, 17 years, and I still remember it. I still remember that moment as if it was yesterday. So this is what it means to have psychological safety, where you can have an environment where you're not expected to be this perfect human. I mean, we're human, right? I'm going to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes. We're all going to make mistakes. But how do we handle those mistakes so that people are not having this fear of completely shutting down when something happens? Or better yet, they're not covering the mistake that you make. So the next thing that we need to ask ourselves is, do we have psychological safety? So I really want you to think about these questions as we're going through this course today. Do we have that psychological safety? So I want you to think about this. Have you ever been in a situation where you made a mistake at work, in a job, career, and that mistake followed you through your entire career? And maybe if it's not you, maybe it's someone that you know. And no matter what you did, what you accomplished, it didn't matter because you were defined by that mistake. Maybe you had to leave the organization or the company that you were working at because that mistake was just always going to follow you. Or have you ever been in a group setting where you made a suggestion and your idea was completely shut down by the group? So just think about these things. Or have you been in a group setting where you had a great idea, but you were afraid to share it? And then moments later, someone in that group shared the same idea that you had. And then you're thinking to yourself, why didn't I just share that idea first? Oh, it's so frustrating. I mean, that's happened to me before. I know the feeling of that. So if you've experienced moments like this, maybe in your career, throughout your life, maybe those chances are that maybe you were in an environment that maybe didn't have a ton of psychological safety. So in order to know if you're working in an environment of psychological safety, we really need to determine, are we working in the psychological danger zone? Because we really need to understand the differences of each. And so one of the things that I put early on when we were doing our MITs is psychological safety isn't just about, being nice or creating this environment where everyone's just nice to each other. It's really about creating an environment where, hey, if you make a mistake, let's thrive on that mistake. How can we thrive on that mistake so that we can become better people? So let's talk about psychological danger, because psychological danger is the opposite of psychological safety, right? Team members feel unsafe to take risks and be vulnerable in front of each other. So really keep that in mind. Think about it. We all bring some level of inhibition and anxiety to the learning process. I mean, we all have insecurities, right? Who hasn't hesitated to raise their hand or ask a question in a big group setting for the fear of feeling silly or dumb? You don't want to look like that in front of your colleagues, your managers, your bosses, your leaders. You don't want to do that. So we just kind of keep that thought to ourselves. Learning, I always say, is both intellectual and it's emotional, and it's an interplay of the head and the heart. I mean, you have to be safe to offer that idea or to say, hey, what about this? You have to be safe in an environment to be vulnerable to do that. So let's talk about, well, what does it mean to be in psychological danger, right? So with psychological danger, you have fear, you have blame, you have unwillingness to share, collaborate. And all of these things that we're talking about in psychological danger basically lead to something called the common knowledge effect. where we all think alike, don't challenge the norm. We're not even creative. We just kind of go with the flow. So think about maybe some teams that you've been on in the past that have had that, where you're just not going to say anything. And so one of the things that I really want to just capture in our heads today is, in our work environments, we're either working in an environment with psychological safety or we're in psychological danger. So how do we know if we're operating in these environments? How do we know if we're in a psychological safety environment or psychological danger environment? One of the things that I've put together today is, well, what are the signs and the symptoms? Because I really think it's important to look at the signs and the symptoms of these two things, because it's really important to know, well, are we in that low psychological safety range? And I have a challenge for you. So I remember in my training, I was doing a training to become an executive coach, and I was challenged to pay attention to what was not being said. And I remember when I was giving that challenge, I said, well, how am I supposed to pay attention to something that's not there? I mean, that's a little bit odd and a little bit tricky, but over time, I got accustomed and I got really good to hearing these omissions that weren't even happening. And the most useful point was, that's how I was able to gauge psychological safety in an organization, simply by observing what was happening and what was not happening. And I started little by little in meetings. I started little by little in big team meetings, and I was able to reflect on those events. So the trick is basically focus less on the content of what's being said and focus more on what's actually being discussed. And how do people relate and how do they act in that environment? And so this led me to understand, well, if we have psychological safety and we're going to talk about that, then we really need to talk about these warning signs. So let's talk about the warning signs. And as we talk about the warning signs, I want you to go ahead and put it in the chat. Which of the warning signs do you think would create the biggest impact to an organization? So think about these as we're going to go ahead and discuss them, and put it in the chat. Which ones do you all think would be the hardest? So let's go ahead and talk about these first, because you're probably looking at the slide saying you don't have anything on the slide. You just have a couple of words. So let's go ahead and talk about this. So sameness. What does that mean? We're all the same. We all think the same, where the team not only lacks diversity, but not in the conventional sense around race, ethnicity, and gender, but also about the diversity of thinking styles. In a psychologically unsafe environment, people who are different just don't fit in. They're either excluded altogether, or they experience some kind of hostile environment and they seek to exclude themselves. So sameness, right? This is one of the telltale signs that I've seen in many organizations. My other one is usual suspects, which I have my little picture there with my dogs doing the lineup there, where basically discussions are dominated by a narrow set of contributors around the table. I mean, have you ever felt that, where maybe it's a large meeting group and there's no room for you around the table? There's no room for your voice to be heard. And some people, what happens here is that some people will fear the consequence of even speaking up, or realize, you know what, there's really no point in me speaking up, because whatever I contribute is either going to be ignored or it's going to be shut down. And as a result of this usual suspects, the discussions lack richness. They lack different perspectives, because let me tell you, sometimes the people that maybe don't talk around the table, sometimes they have the best ideas. I always joke with my brother. My brother's an analytical personality type, and he is the smartest person I feel like ever. And it's funny because even when we were growing up, he never had to study, but he got the good grades. I always had to work hard to get the good grades, and it would just come easily and naturally to him. But it's funny because he doesn't really talk much around the table unless someone says, hey, what kind of idea do you have? And so sometimes we can get into that position of usual suspects in our room. The next one that I have here is yes people, where there's sometimes an unrealistic set of agreement that we just stick to, or there's an absence of challenge, where, you know what, even though we think there's an idea out there that is just crazy, we don't want to challenge it because it's just not going to be good if we do that. So we just support the views, the opinions, and those decisions of the people that are making those decisions around the table. Because if we challenge it, what's going to happen? Conflict is dangerous. Nobody dares to raise topics or even provoke it or even ask the question. We're just going to say yes, and we're just going to go with it. I mean, we all know what that feels like, right? This one, my next one here is one of my favorite ones. Not that it's a good one, but it's one of my favorite ones because I feel like it happens a lot. And as in my experience as a consultant, I've seen it a lot too. So we have invulnerability, where group members are supposed to be seen. They don't want to be seen as lacking. You're never going to hear people say, I need help, or I don't understand that. And I asked you that question earlier about psychological danger. Have you ever been in an environment where maybe you're given a task, but because you don't want to seem as vulnerable, you're not even going to go to the person giving you that task and saying, hey, can you explain this to me again? Because if you did that, it just wouldn't be a good thing for you. So that absence is where that psychological safety, that fear of making ourselves vulnerable comes up. And that's why I have that superhero sign up there. I don't need, I don't understand. You're never going to hear that. We don't know what we're doing as a team. We don't know what we're going. We don't know what the direction is. We're just going to do whatever it is that we're doing. And then my last one here is fear of failure, where there's signs of intolerance and they're common if something goes wrong. In a workplace that lacks psychological safety, attitude towards failure lead to excessive caution. I've seen this before where people are just, oh, I'm just so afraid to make a mistake or anything, so I'm just going to not take the risk. I'm not going to experiment. And here's the thing, the problem with that, the fear of failure, is that it really leads to little room for creativity. And it always, every time I talk about the fear of failure, I always think about Disneyland, because Walt Disney himself was rejected more than 300 times before Mickey Mouse became a success. I mean, how many times did he fail? I mean, imagine if he just gave up after the first time. We wouldn't have Disneyland. What would we do? What would we do without Disneyland, right? So when we talk about these signs, out of all these signs that we've just talked about, go ahead and you can either go ahead and use your annotation tools, or you can go ahead and put it in the chat. You can stamp each one. Which one do you think, out of all these warning signs, which one do you think has the most impact to your organization or your department, and why? And you can go ahead and come off mute. This is a psychologically safe environment. We're all in here together. And I'd like to hear about which one would be the most impactful to your organization, or which one have you even seen? It's important to have these conversations. I'm going to go ahead and put the chat down here. What are some thoughts? Fear of failure. Okay, I've seen invulnerability, fear of failure. Yes, people. And who would like to come off mute and have a conversation with why did you pick the one that you picked? Oh, Erica, that's a good one. Sameness. It's always been done this way. We're not even going to challenge or be creative in another thing, right? We're just going to do it this way because that's how it's always been done before.
I'm coming off mute.
Awesome. Thanks, Lily.
Yeah, so I'm not actually sure if I should be putting this under yes people or usual suspects, but I know that I've been in a few meetings where we talking about a particular thing, maybe something new that's coming up, or something that people are proposing, and I personally will be feeling like, I don't know about this. I have some like serious questions about whether we should be doing this thing or not. And everybody else will be, oh, okay, we're going along with this. And then finally I'll come out and say, hey, I'm really concerned about X, Y, and Z. And all of a sudden the whole like air in the room shifts and everybody goes, well, not everybody, but several people will say, I had that too, but then I just thought maybe I was stupid for not understanding, or maybe it was, maybe I just didn't get the whole picture. So it's like there's a self-doubt because
Right.
Everybody else is acting like, okay, this makes sense, but it's because they're feeling like their doubt is maybe not valid.
Right.
So I've been in meetings where all it takes is one person asking some questions that might be viewed as contrary to whatever's going on. but it only takes one person asking that to actually shift the whole conversation and maybe the whole, what do you call it? The direction of the project.
Right, it's like
but I'm
all of a
always
sudden-
shocked when people are saying, oh, yes, I wanted to ask that and I was concerned and I just thought I was confused.
Right. It's very interesting, and it's funny because it only, I think that you're right. It takes that one person to be vulnerable of, you know what, I don't understand this. And it's so funny because I'm so thankful for those people, and I want to be better at that, right? Saying, you know, I don't know if I agree with this. How about if we do it this way? And then all of a sudden everyone agrees with you. It's like, yeah, well, no, we were thinking the same thing. It's that fear, right? Why do you think people do that? If we have that doubt, how come we do that?
I mean, it might be a little bit of imposter syndrome.
Mhm.
I think it comes from even being in school. You raise your hand, you answer a question, it's the wrong answer, and then you get laughed at.
Right.
And then that kind of goes with you as you get older, and you kind of go back to that. Oh, if I answer this question or I make the question, it's going to take me back to middle school or high school, and it's not a great feeling to have.
Right. You know, Isidra Martinez, she's my co-professional development chair, and I don't know if she's on the call today, but one of the stories that she shares is when I was in school, you know, I knew the answers. I would go into school and I always had the right answer. I would raise my hand, and she did share this story with the lead cohort group about a week ago. And she said that every time she rose her hand, she always had the right answer, but one time she didn't. And that one time she was laughed at. And after that, she never rose her hand again. And it's because, again, it goes back to that need that we have of people, right? We don't like to be placed in unsafe environments, because why would we want to be placed in an unsafe environment? We want to make sure that we're safe and that we create that environment for our teams and ourselves. So before we go to our next slide, which right now we're going to go ahead and do a turning point. Now that we've talked about these warning signs, how do we create psychological safety? And better yet, how do we maintain psychological safety? But before we go to our next slide, does anybody else have any thoughts on the warning signs, on the impacts, on what you've seen? Because, you know, we want to talk about, well, how do we not fix it? You know, I always tell people, I wish I had this magic wand that I can give every one of you and saying, okay, you all have it now. We have to continue to work on this. So any other thoughts before we move on to our next point here? We're good. I'm really bad at, if you're raising your hand, I'm really bad at it. So I'm trying to see. Okay, I think we're good. If you all have any thoughts, go ahead and raise your hand, come off mute. You can go ahead and interrupt. We can go ahead and have that conversation. So our next question here is, how do we create that psychological safety that we want, right? How do we create that in our teams? So let's go ahead and go to our next slide here. There are many studies out there, many research that you can look up. And a lot of times people say, well, this is how you can create psychological safety. And so I was able to pull together from different studies, kind of like the top 5 on how to create those psychological safety moments and how to maintain that within your team. And what I'm going to also give you today is I'm going to give you some toolkits that you can take away from this training so that you can continue to do this with your team. So our very first one today is, how do we create psychological safety at work? So I have an application question for you, and it is, what behaviors can you demonstrate to create psychological safety in each of these areas? And then how do you, because you don't have to be the leader of the department or the org, you can create psychological safety from any chair that you sit in. How do these behaviors encourage a psychological safe environment? So one thing that will also help us create and maintain psychological safety is using effective tools. And one of the tools that I'm going to give you in today's session is an assessment that you can do on your own, or you could even do it on your teams. And so I want you to just take a quick look at it here. Is to measure psychological safety, one of the things that Dr. Amy Edmondson did was she asked team members to look at this sheet that I'm showing up right now, and they asked, how strongly do you agree or disagree with these comments? And so what I want right now for you to do is just take 1 minute to ask yourself these questions. Your answer to these questions are going to help you determine if you're working on a team that has that psychological safety, or maybe there's a little bit of improvement that we could be doing on that team. Because when psychological safety is lacking, one of the things that we've talked about today is that you're at risk for not innovating, you're at risk for having people leave, and you're not going to be able to retain your talented employees. And of course, we might miss something that's really crucial by someone that's just going to leave our organization. So one of the things that you can do is this assessment. So Brittany and Kate, can you go ahead and send, there's 3 attachments that I have. And one of them is the assessment. Another one is a tool on how can we get from stage 1 of psychological safety all the way through stage 4. It's kind of like, I don't know, I think we've talked about it sometimes in my team dynamics course, and some of you have taken that course, is basically Tuckman's model of team dynamics. How do you go from the forming stage all the way to performing? Well, there are certain stages, same thing with psychological safety. So Kate and Brittany are going to go ahead and give you those resources, because I really feel that this is a really good starting point. And once you do this assessment with your team, I have some application questions for you all. And one of the things that I will do after this training is I will get you all this PowerPoint so that you can take the application questions with you. Once you do this assessment, I really want you to do the next step planning stages, right? Identify which one of the statements were your lowest. And out of those areas, what can you do to improve your score on the lowest? So if I go back to this one and I said, disagree on number 1 and number 2, what can I do in my team? And again, you can do this on Google Forms or Qualtrics. We use Qualtrics at UCR, where it could be anonymous. And this could be a really good first step for psychological safety on your team. The other one is, how can you keep getting better? So identify the statements that you have the strongest psychological safety, the ones that you strongly agreed on. What can you do to maintain that strong psychological safety? Because again, it's not about maintaining, it's about continuously getting better at whatever it is that we're doing in our units right now. So that's a really good action planning next steps. I will go ahead and send you that information. I believe you already have it in the chat. Go ahead and download that. And the other key piece that I really want you to understand as we end is that Google, we all know Google. I mean, a huge organization. They spent 2 years dedicating so much resources. They studied over 180 teams, and they wanted to ask and answer the question that was, what makes a team effective? That was the number 1 question. So like I like to say, the $1 million question, right? What makes a team effective? And through their 2-year research study, the number 1 thing was psychological safety. Psychological safety is more than a feel-good word to make people become engaged. It's a critical component of a high-performing team. So if we have that psychological safety, we can have that high-performing team. And on top of that project that lasted over 2 years, they noticed that there's 5 other components that are deemed effective, but psychological safety is what builds that foundation. And that's what's basically going to give people the power that they need to continuously stay in that organization. Google also found that people that had higher psychological safety were less likely to leave, and they were more likely to have great ideas, diverse ideas for their teammates, and they were seen as executives as becoming twice as impacting the organization. So again, this is a key component, and I know that if we all work together, we can get the entire UCR community to believe in this and to continuously improve on this day in and day out. These are the resources that I'm going to be giving you today, which is the components of different psychological safety. But I always like to leave all my training sessions with a reflection. And that reflection is, how are you going to contribute to an environment of psychological safety? And what role are you going to play? Because at the end of the day, creating psychological safety is that we can achieve our organizational goals. And at the same time, we can create an environment that's just decent. It's human, it's safe. Because we all are going to thrive in an environment that allows us to do 4 things. We're going to thrive in an environment that lets us feel included, feel safe to learn, feel safe to contribute, and feel safe to challenge the status quo. And if we can't do those things, it's too expensive. And that fear eventually is going to take over, and that fear is going to shut us down. Because at the end of the day, us as people, we're not going to be happy if we're not reaching our full potential. So again, I'm so thankful that you all took an hour out of your day to just be here with me and to really understand the importance of this, because I really do think that we can continue to do great things. I am leading a 5-people cohort with Isidra Martinez, and the topic is psychological safety. And I really want you all to challenge yourself and ask you this question. Ask yourself, are you creating an environment where others can do the same? Are you creating an environment where others can do the 4 things that I just mentioned? Feel safe, feel included, feel able to challenge the status quo, and feel safe to learn. So just always ask those questions, because that's the first start. So again, thank you so much for being here with me today. I am sending these resources over to you. If you all have any questions, I know that this went by really, really fast. I hope that you enjoyed it. And if there's anything that my team EOD can do for you, we are always available to you. And I'm really excited to be doing this with our cohort. So I really appreciate all of you for being here.